Hello, hello, and welcome to Temple of the False Pod, where our decks aren't optimized, but our plays sure as heck are fun. I'm Andy.
I'm Bruce.
And this evening, we're going to talk to you about the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! I'm bluffing. We're going to talk about Magic and bluffing. I'm terrible at it, as you can tell. This is a Magic podcast, and so we've both been in games where we've been in a situation, and I'm sure all of you have, where you are neither the person with the most power or the least power, and somebody's threatening to take you out of the game. So one of your tools in your arsenal sometimes just has to be to bluff, right?
I wouldn't even wait for that moment. To me, one of the play groups that I was in early on, they were big on the politics, big on threats that were just sort of hanging there, or promises of help or whatever.
What do you mean?
It was a steady stream of politics all the time. So, if you do this, I will do this. I will help you if you do this. Or I won't attack you if you attack him.
Or I won't kill your big creature if you don't attack me.
Right. There was all sorts of politics that went on. Now, so there's that, but then there's the bluffing aspect is like a part of that, because the bluff isn't necessarily I will do something to help you if you then do something else. When we're talking about a bluff, it's I'm saying something and you don't know if I'm going to do it. The focus to me really on the bluff is it very much ties into the whole concept of I'm going to attack one of two people and one of them says something which implies it would be a grave error on your part to swing my way. But there's no reason on the board to believe that that's the case. There's no both parties have no creatures to stop you. You can easily swing in on either one of them and they're going to take the damage. Unless they have something in their hands. Mm-hmm. And either one of them could have something in their hands, but one of them is saying it's really going to hurt you if you swing at me. And people
at any point in the game, either of them could say that. You don't know if it's true, and especially if they're keeping mana up. It kind of goes the same with keeping up mana to bluff a counter. It's this threat that could be there or it could be empty.
Right.
I don't remember the point I was going to make, but I think generally it's this thing where some people just say things to just get you to do nothing.
Right. Well, and the reason I brought up this early play group was my card collection was pretty slim back then. So and it reflected in my decks. My decks just simply didn't have the depth of threats that a lot of the other decks had, just because I just didn't have the cards to be able to make the decks that were that threatening. So a lot of times my opponents knew I had some cards that could do things, but they never knew if I was actually holding them or not. So it became a question of whether should I attack Bruce or not. So, sometimes I'd keep quiet and sometimes I wouldn't. And generally speaking, initially I tried to make sure that every time I said, you don't want to do that if they came my way, I did something about it. I tried to create the situation where I was never bluffing, where I never bluffed, where, I lost a lot of games because I was unwilling to make the statement because I couldn't back it up.
It's the Canadian unit, Bruce.
No, it was the build-up. Because once you got to the point where people believed everything you were saying, because you backed it up over and over again, your bluff, when you did do it, was far more likely to be believed, and then they just go elsewhere. So after getting beat up and being trustworthy and doing all of this sort of thing for, a good 6 months of with a group where we play every week, players started to trust that what was coming out of my mouth was the truth. And then I was able to get away with some bluffing because I would say stuff that wasn't true anymore. And the players wouldn't really call me on it, at least not very often. So it worked out, it worked out fairly well for me. Now, that was definitely the long game, but it was something that I felt like I really needed to work on because I just didn't have decks that were as strong as theirs. My political game and the bluffing aspect really had to be good because I needed to make up ground because of my weaker deck. So
yeah, I definitely know the feeling. I have that scope of a collection more or less. Yeah. When I need to go deeper, I just buy singles. But I definitely need to work on my bluffing. I'm so quickly like, I got nothing, and then I move on. Like if somebody's threatening me with these huge creatures, or even threatening multiple of us with these huge creatures, and I'm like, oh well, like I don't have any removal, like, and I mean a bit of it's experience, a bit of it's maybe strategic,
right?
But I know I've been in those games too where it's easy to just stay quiet and see if somebody else deals with it,
right? And to bluff doesn't necessarily mean you have to be spouting off,
right?
Some of the best ways to bluff are if you're simply behaving like you have zero concern over the creature that is obviously has the capability of doing significant damage, and you've barely given it a thought. You haven't reached over to grab the card to get a look and see exactly what the hell this thing does, because you're portraying this attitude of, I really don't care. It's irrelevant because of what I have in my hand. You don't have to say anything, but you've already started the bluff. Now, obviously, part of that's tied to your personality. If your personality is somebody who doesn't do that, well, then nobody's going for that bluff. But you have to you have to do the bluff according to your personality. So if when you play Magic you're a little more bombastic and a little more blah blah blah, then that is how you have to run your bluff, assuming that you want to. So the first part for this particular podcast that I wanted to look at was, when do you bluff? So I mean,
always.
Well, I mean, when I started it off by sort of describing how I set it up in my early play group. The idea was that I just didn't bluff until I had developed a reputation as someone who doesn't bluff. That when he says something, it's going to be true. And it wasn't until I was confident that I wasn't going to get called on it, and that's when I started to bluff. So that's certainly one area. But I was sort of thinking more along the lines about in-game. But
yeah, it's like the reverse Boy Who Cried Wolf. Like,
yeah,
you just keep telling the truth until you don't.
Right.
I got my eye on you, Bruce. Got my eye on you.
I'll take my chances. It just maybe it means that for the next 6 months I've actually got to come through on all of it. As far as when, though, I mean, you really do have to call your shots, and you really do have to understand the board state from the point of view of your opponents. I think one of the biggest areas is if your opponent is looking to attack either you or another opponent. There is no point in making the bluff if one of you is the obvious target, and whether you have the card or not is irrelevant. If you and I are the two players that could be attacked, but
right, and I'm either like really, really ahead, or if I have zero blockers.
Exactly. If you're at 45 life target, and I'm at 5,
right?
Well, and you've got a massive board state. Well, then there's no point in swinging at me. At that point, I'm a meat shield. So there's certainly no point in me offering up a bluff. Like, why would I say, you really don't want to attack me, as though I've got a card that's going to hurt them? Because why would you use it? You're much better off in jumping straight to politics and being like, look, you can kill me, but you're just forcing Andy, or you're making it easier for Andy, because on the next turn he's just going to swing at you because you're the only option left. Or you can leave me out there and force him to send a couple creatures my way to wipe me off the board. So, in those situations, it doesn't make sense to bluff. And while the scenario I described is fairly obvious, there are other times when it's a lot more subtle. And, if you've got an opponent he's got one creature and he's going to swing with this, but he just doesn't know where. It's like, okay, well, look at it from their perspective. It doesn't do you much good to say, I can, if you're in a color that's, that has limited removal, then threatening it is a little more questionable. They're a little less likely to believe it. If I'm running white and I've just cast Swords to Plowshares, and you can see, all you have to do is flip through my graveyard, and you can see 2 other removal spells in there. Well, maybe that's not the time you want to bluff, because they're likely going to call you on it, because they're going to be like, no, you're full of crap. So that's probably not the best time when to offer up the bluff. So.
Yeah, or if, like, say you're in white and they put, like, down an enchantment that nobody wants around. If you're in white or blue, or I guess red or green can deal with it. Black has a harder time. Like you have to think about the scenario in which it would be a good time to bluff, and realize if you're not in it, probably shouldn't. Making these faces as if I can be seen.
It just, you don't want to create a situation where your bluff is you saying you have a card, and the likelihood of you actually having that card is barely 1%.
Right.
It's just not believable, and they're much more likely to call you on it. Now, if you have it, then that's a whole different story. But you also don't want to be announcing that you have it, because then you've created a scenario where, okay, he's not threatening me with anything, so therefore he doesn't have it. So you don't want to be the person who's always saying, I've got it, and then coming through with it over and over again. You're better off just saying nothing.
Right.
And leaving them to wonder. But
not always, though.
Well, exactly.
There are times.
You have to balance.
And the issue, too, is like, it's sometimes very easy to find out if the bluff was a lie. And
you definitely don't want to create a situation where that gets tossed in your face. You don't want to be known as the guy who, whose bluffs aren't, who is just tossing out the bluff, who is faking it. Right.
Because sometimes it's like, oh, like, I won't kill your big creature if you don't attack me for 2 turns or whatever. But the unsaid part of that bluff is, I wouldn't kill it either, like, if we don't take this deal. But that's the bluff, is like that unsaid part of I wouldn't do anything anyway.
Right. Yeah, I mean, if you've just bluffed on 2 consecutive turns, probably not a good idea to try it again.
Yeah.
Because at some point, they are going to call you on it. They have to. They just have to at some point. So you don't really want to be putting yourself in the situation where you have to prove that you have it.
So we've talked about when not to bluff. What are some specifics about when to bluff? Just, I guess, any other time, or?
Well, for me, I like to save the bluff for late game situations.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, situations where it's dire, where especially as you get later in the game, you've drawn more cards. You are more likely to have whatever it is you're claiming that you have. So those bluffs become much more believable. And on top of that, they tend to involve situations where the damage is way higher. I can definitely bluff early on and try and discourage you from sending your 2/2 creature my way. And maybe it'll work. But then I used up a bluff.
Yeah.
On something that in the end, the greater scheme of things, is just irrelevant. So I want to save it towards the end of the game. The other part is I also don't want to do it all the time. I don't want to bluff every game. I don't even want to if I'm going to bluff, I don't want to do it more than once a night. I don't want to become that person who is known for this. Because then in the end, even if you do have it half of the time, if at that point the bluff is effectively nothing. Because they're not going to know if you have it or you don't. So whether you say it has really no effect whatsoever on their decision making. Because they're like, yeah, sometimes he has it, sometimes he doesn't. It's irrelevant because I don't know which it is in this situation. When you bluff, you want them to be like, oh, he actually said that. Now I really got to think about this because there's some weight behind this. Now, admittedly, you're bluffing in situations where the stakes are high. So maybe they're going to look at this and say, you know what, if he's got it, he's got it. But the idea is that you're bluffing to try and create a situation where you're like, okay, look, you could use that creature now on me, or you could get a free ride and go somewhere else. So just take the free ride. And that's when you want to bluff. At least for me. What about for you?
It's interesting because I think there's such a, I mean, as with everything, there's this spectrum of bluffing. I think bluffing can come down to even when like somebody's doing a big play and they're waiting for that counter or they're waiting for like removal or anybody to respond to anything, and you're just staring at 2 land in your hand, and then you don't say anything. You're just like, all right, that's fine. I mean, they have to assume that maybe you have something. But for me, I think with bluffing, it has to be mid to late game. I think early game bluffing is absurd. Nobody's doing really much of anything, at least in our more casual games. And it's tough because I'm so on my sleeve about everything. I wear all of my emotions pretty much on my sleeve. Makes for a very easy game against me. But I think with that, I think it's maybe I can use that to my advantage. I think that comes with not only being young, and I mean, I'm not terribly young, but I'm a young person. And emotional, but also inexperienced.
Mm-hmm.
I never know the full consequences of what my lost potential bluff is. So I generally don't bluff. But when I do, I mean, it's when I do, it's generally, like I stare at my hand, which is harder to do on things like Spell Table. You don't have that like face-to-face contact of immediate reactions. You have to make your intent more known. So more of these political strategies of bluffing, it's hard for me to be like, okay, like I could have this card in my hand and pretend that I have this, but I usually go the route of bluffing by omission.
Right. And I mean, honestly, the most, probably the most common bluff. Just a second.
Yeah. Right.
Hang on.
Or like,
hang on. And then you look at your cards and you flip them around, and you've got 3 cards in your hand, and you're flipping through them, and you're looking at them, and it's there's an island and a mountain, and you're flipping through them. You're like, okay, and then they just go along, and then they just keep going, because now suddenly they think he may have a way to stop something. He just doesn't think this is worth it yet to pull the trigger. And, that's sort of the bluff beforehand, because you're building, you're trying to create a rattlesnake card, warning people away, but you don't have anything.
Right. Or even like, let me know when you're going to combat.
Yeah.
Or very clearly leaving up all your mana.
Yeah.
For whatever. I think that is also an easy bluff. Is if you've got a handful of mana, you can't really do much about, or a handful of lands. You can't really do much about it other than bluff. I guess, except if you were to just be like, I got nothing. All I got is a hand of land, which has its merits, I guess.
Well, here, another combat, another situation. Like, if I have a like, recently we played a game, and I can't remember the name of the spell. It gave my creature double strike and trample because it was big enough.
Temur Battle Rage.
Right. So
yep,
we play that. So you've seen it. Now, we're playing 60 card. So in the next turn, I swing with the same creature again. And, before you get a chance to declare blockers, I make sure that I am showing that 1 red and 1 generic mana. Like, I make sure that that's real clear. I've got that sitting there on the board. It's ready. To the point where I could even put my hand on it, because it's spell table, and that's what you can see.
That was one of the hardest choices I had to make. Was like, is he bluffing? Are you bluffing having another one, or do you have something like it? Or do you have a way to find it?
Exactly. And so you're looking at that, and that affects how you decide whether or not you're going to block. Because if you assume that I have it, in other words, you go for the bluff, okay, if he has it, then his creature gets double strike and trample. Does it make sense, if I know that he doesn't have double strike, I can, a double strike or trample, I can put enough creatures in front of it to kill it. But if he has double strike and trample, well, then he does the damage, kills all my creatures before I can do anything about it, and then still spills over. So wouldn't I be better off just letting a few extra points of damage spill over and saving my creatures to crack back? In that, in the game that I'm talking about, which was last week, in fact, it wasn't a bluff, and it was irrelevant because if Andy didn't block with everything, he was going to die. So
right. And I think I ended up still dying. I think
you ended up dying anyway.
Had exact.
Yeah. So, in that case, it wasn't a bluff. It was just, I swung. You decide if you're going to block.
Waited for the moment.
Right.
Yeah.
And then I was going to swing, whether I had the card or not. That's what that creature was out there to do. So I would just swing. And it didn't matter to me whether I had the card or not. Because I'm like, I'll swing and take out one of your creatures. I'm good. Just keep rolling. But,
and I think that's such like the perfect example of that is a very specific reason, or a very specific reason to always bluff in that scenario. If you didn't have it, you would kill a number of my creatures.
Right.
If you did have it, you would win.
Well, then you have to run as though the bluff exists.
Right. And I think with that kind of idea, it's so easy to get caught up in the idea that, like, oh, I should always be bluffing. And I've played games against people who just, like, constantly bluff, and it's like, come on. Like,
well, and like we discussed earlier, if you constantly bluff, just no one believes you anymore. Then it really is the boy who cried wolf, because it's irrelevant. Like, I know that you lie all the time about this stuff. It stops being a bluff and just starts being, look, you're just spouting your mouth off. I don't really care what you've got to say because it's irrelevant to what you have in your hand. So I'm just going to make my decision based on what I think I should do and go from there. So, Yeah.
Yeah, and before we go any further, let's throw it over to our sponsor. So here we go. We'll be right back. This episode of Temple of the False Spot is brought to you by the Reaper King.
Hey, I'm Big Bob, the Reaper King, and do I have the real estate for you? Are you looking for a place to go on the weekends to untap? Or as the gloom of a Shadowmoor deepens, you're looking for a place to, unwind a little? Do we have a place for you? Act now, because spaces are filling up at our very own Cascade Bluffs. Just call 222-2266 and ask for me, Big Bob, the Reaper King, to get your very own Cascade Bluff today. What? Don't you trust me? Now back to you, baby!
Alright, yeah. Anyway.
So finally and we've already alluded to this at some point, the response to the bluff. If you think your opponent is bluffing, if there's this to me it's the classic. I'm going to swing with this creature, and the opponent says, I wouldn't swing at me if I were you. I mean, this is straight up. Do they have it, or are they bluffing? So, what do you do in that situation?
Personally?
Yeah.
I mean,
obviously.
Well,
obviously, I mean, there's a certain amount of, you're going to look at the options and make the decision, or at least your decision should already be leaning one way or the other.
Right.
Ignoring what they say.
Yeah.
How am I going to attack? If I was already going to attack the other person, well, then I really don't care that they've made this statement. And in fact, I can now use this and say, "Ooh, I can be influenced by bluffing. So you should keep doing that, and eventually you'll leave yourself wide open because you think that you can just talk your way out of the trouble."
Yeah,
and then I'll hammer you. But you can do that, or you can start to play it in as far as what you think.
Yeah. So. Personally, I mean, to bring up an example of a game played last week, it was you, me, and a third person. Mm-hmm. Third person was like, I was getting ready to go to combat. He was like, let me know when you get to combat. I said, okay, I'm going to combat. He was like, okay, who are you going to attack? And I was like, I mean, I had Grenzo Havoc Razor out. I was ready to end the game by having you and this other person attack each other until one of you died.
Right.
So I was like, I'm going for the person who doesn't have any defenses up. And it was like, clearly this person was bluffing, but it didn't matter to me.
Right.
I know for a fact that this person had the threat that they were threatening me with. So it wasn't necessarily a bluff. It was just kind of like a out of nowhere threat, where they mm-hmm. knew that the end game was coming and they were worried that they wouldn't be there for it. But it's tough because, like you said, like if I'm already not going for the person who's bluffing, it doesn't affect my choice at all. I'm just going to go for it.
Right.
If I was going to go for that person, I really have to think about like what are the threats that it could be, and what are the chances that they have it, and if the other choice is to go or is to not even go for the other person, like there's a reason I'm not going for the other person, and generally it's because the other person has a bigger like board state, or seems more of a threat, or isn't a threat at all. So it's like it's a matter of if somebody's threatening me and I'm already going for them, I'm going to continue going for them because I've already made the decision to go for them. And sometimes it spells disaster for me. But if my other choice is to not do anything, then I'm just slowing down the game.
Right. No.
And I'll look foolish if
right.
if they were just bluffing.
Now, for me,
And I ain't no fool.
So for me, when I am presented with someone who is offering this option, so I'm left with the question: are they bluffing, or do they have it? If they're offering it as for informational purposes, meaning, if you swing this way, I think I can supplement it. Mm-hmm. Well, at that point I say to myself, well, which way did I intend to go? And I will just go that way. And then also realize that if I swing the other way, it's probably going to hit for more.
Right. Now, I guess
how does that affect my result? But when the bluff is that whole, I wouldn't come this way if I were you. This veiled threat of, I guess I have a card and it's going to wreck you. For me, I'm coming at them every time because I hate that crap. Don't threaten me in a game of Magic. Don't try and influence where I'm going based on a bluff, because, man, too many times I am easily influenced to swing at you when you say that. It drives me crazy when people say that stuff. And if it means that I walk into it more often than I should, fine. Because I truly believe if I'm going to walk into it, then you just burned your spell. You now have to burn the spell to prove me wrong. Because if you don't, then the next guy up also knows you're bluffing.
You just made it personal, kid.
You just demonstrated you've got nothing in your hand to stop any of us. So now you are wide open. You might as well have no cards in hand and no mana untapped, because you just showed that you got nothing. And even if you do have something and you do stuff me, the next guy has got to be looking at your hand and thinking about what you've just done and said, they can't do that again. So they're going to be influenced to go your way. And quite honestly, if they're not, I'm going to remind them that in fact, they just burned a removal spell. How many more do you think they have in their hand? How much mana do they have left? I'm going to demonstrate what a weakened position they're in, because I don't want the loss that I just took to go for naught.
Yeah.
And I'm going to go for it. And I would argue that what I'm doing there is politics, not bluffing. I'm making sure that and it's barely even politics, because at that point, I'm just trying to demonstrate the odds that they've got something for you on top of after having just dealt with me are not good. So take your shot.
Yeah, and I think it's this mistake that a lot of players tend to have, where they mistake politics and bluffing. Like they think it's one and the same. Where it's like, oh, if you don't, I mean, I've brought up this example a couple times already, where it's like, oh, if you don't come for me, like, I won't come for you for the next couple turns.
Right.
Or like, if you don't attack me with that creature, I won't kill it. And it's like, that is a bluff, but also like, it's such a vague threat.
Yeah.
That it's not political enough.
Right.
It's not this idea that you are at all giving up something to compromise.
And honestly, all other things being equal, I'm going to swing at you if you make that offer to me. Like, yeah? Go. No, bam! Come at me. Because I'm just not putting up with that crap. Not going to do it. I mean, I've played with enough opponents who have the... I mean, I think most people have played with the player who says, I won't be attacking anyone unless somebody attacks me. And if they attack me, then they are my enemy for the rest of the game. I've played with those kind of people. They've been in my play
bold strategy.
And I don't care. I'm not going to take your threat, whether it's empty or not, and play into this. I'm swinging at you. Fine.
Yeah,
fine.
and if they build up fast enough, they're going to be
you know what?
clearly the threat.
Come at me for the rest of the game.
For everyone
but
else.
As long as you keep coming at me, you're going to lose. And their attitude is, I don't care if I lose. I just want to discourage you from swinging at me. And I've said to these players over and over again, just so you're aware, you taking me out of this game will do nothing to discourage me from swinging at you the next game. So take your strategy and stuff it, because it's not going to work here. Because I'm prepared to lose as much as you are to make you stop playing this ridiculous game. So, anyways, I know I'm getting off of the bluffing aspect, but
I mean, with that strategy, it's a bit of a bluff. Like, they have to believe enough, or they have to like emphasize enough this idea that they could even end up taking you out because you attacked them. Like, this is a multiplayer game, not,
Right. Well, if you've got one opponent who's entirely dedicated to taking you out of the game and is ignoring everyone else and honestly doesn't even care if they live, they'll take you out of the game. Because the average person's multiplayer deck can't handle one player consistently going at them nonstop the whole time. You have to burn up too many resources to protect yourself, and at some point take them out of the game to then be in a position to actually be able to do anything. So I get where they're going, and I get the idea that it's out there, and they don't treat it as a bluff. They treat it as a fact. I'm coming at you every time. Now, like I said, I hate that, and I am going to come at you over and over again, and we're just going to have to
run them right out of town.
Yeah. You just have to understand this is not a play style that's going to be acceptable for me, and we are not going to have a fun night because I'm just going to keep coming.
I think, like, in the same kind of vein, my favorite, and I'm going to use air quotes there, kind of bluff, I guess, politicking, is when you attack somebody and they're like, oh, why me? And it's like whether you assessed to the board or not, that's not a good enough reason to not attack you.
Because I decided it was time to swing at you.
Right. Especially when it's like the beginning of the game, and it's like,
right,
because I need this game to start.
Right. Well, that isn't, and to me, that at that point, that's not even a bluff. There's no threat of anything behind it. There's no promise of anything behind it. That's just a straight up whine. Why me? Why me? I'm like, well, because it's your freaking turn. And I played against
a game?
And I played against players like that too, who they do this in the hopes of getting a free pass for the first handful of turns while everybody else takes a few points of damage.
Yeah.
And
I've definitely fallen for it, but at the same time, like, it's a thing where if it was why me XYZ reasons, like you should be attacking this person because this board state, or you like this person is clearly more of a threat, or whatever, or like this person's wide open, like that's one thing. But when it's just the why me, don't attack me,
right. If your why me is followed up with, does this really make sense? Because I'm looking at the threat assessment as this, and this. I don't really see why you would swing at me when I only have this. A lot of times those sorts of threat assessments, and I use that in air quotes, are political, balderdash. It's not, there's no accuracy behind it at all. They're not looking at it from that person's perspective. Take your pick, but it just I look at that, and again, that comes down to when you're going to bluff. Don't make the bluff if you're just creating a situation where they are going to call your bluff, where they have to. If you are way out in front and it is obvious, and they swing at you, you can't, or threaten to swing towards you, you can't bluff at that point. They've got nowhere else to go. Whatever you're threatening, even if it's death, they're going to die anyway. So then take their shot. And, and if you do kill them, well, then you kill them. And, what was the net loss for them? Nothing, because they were going to die anyway. So the basic focus is, keep in mind when you're bluffing, and keep your opponent in mind. Keep their board state in mind. Keep their situation in mind. And look at it from their perspective before you make the bluff. Because there are times when they're going to call you on it, and you do not want to be bluffing when they feel like they have to call you on it. That's the worst time to bluff, because they're going to call you on it, and your bluff is going to be seen, and then every bluff you make afterwards is less effective.
Yeah.
And then should you bluff? I think you can. I wouldn't overdo it, but just sort of keep it in mind. It is a tool. It's a tool. Don't abuse the tool. And then as far as a response to the bluff, I leave that up to you. I know where I stand on it, and I probably call the bluff way too often, especially if I feel like the bluff is being made in a way to try and control how I'm playing the game. Then I'm just going to come at you, and if you've got it, you've got it, and if you don't, well, I've called you on it, and I'm going to keep doing that over and over again. So stop trying to convince me to go one way or the other. It's irrelevant for you to even say it.
I think it helps that, for me, it's a similar situation, but I think it helps that our playgroup generally, A, doesn't bluff too often.
Right.
And B, when they do, they're not, I'd say 75% of the time, they're not really great at it. So it's like, you can probably generally tell when they're bluffing, unless it's such a minor bluff, like, oh, I'm holding up a counterspell, etc. Sometimes it's just so hard to tell because the stakes aren't high enough that it's like...
our group does it so infrequently that, quite honestly, most of the time when they say something and it could be a bluff, it probably isn't.
Right.
Because bluffing happens so infrequently in our games. Because more often than not, it's not said as a way to get you to go somewhere else. It's sort of like, I really like your creature. I really like what it does against them.
Right.
Please don't.
It's actively helping my board state.
Right.
Me.
Please don't make me kill it. Yeah, and then you swing in and they kill it, and it's like, I was warning you. I said you had to do this, and it's like, well, at that point, it's their turn. You understood what was coming, and you agreed to it. Because like I said, it's just weighing the bluff, and in with our particular group, it's rarely a bluff. So if you're walking into it, you're expecting them to actually play the card. You've calculated that, and hey, and if it turns out it was a bluff, well, awesome! You just got a freebie, and you get to make them look like a sucker, and everybody gets a good laugh. So,
bluffing, it's I was gonna say a tool, but that's what you already said.
Don't be a tool.
Got anything else written down for bluffs?
We covered the points I wanted to cover on this. It's something that I understand that it's a very playgroup specific topic. Some groups do a lot of it, some groups do none of it, and it's something that you'll want to keep in mind with your group and how that'll work. There are groups where I would recommend you never bluff, just because that's not something the group does, and they're going to frown on you if they find out that you were bluffing. And then it's just something that's being held over your head the entire time. But for the most part, every once in a while. There's a reason we hold our cards up and you can't see them.
Yeah. Especially now that we're playing on spell table, can't really see.
Or you can't even see their hand.
Yeah. I'm gonna keep an eye on you, Bruce. Next time, next game we play in 2 days.
You watch. Suddenly everybody's asking, how many cards do you have in hand?
Oh yeah, last week when we were playing, there were points where I had no cards in hand. And I'm pretty sure nobody knew that.
Right.
And it felt so good because I'm sure people were like, I wonder what Andy's got holding up. Like, Nope, nothing.
Nothing. Nothing up my short sleeves.
The benefits of modern technology, everyone.
There we go.
The ever-evolving landscape of magic technology. Sounds like an oxymoron to me.
So, all right, Andy. I think we
All
wrap
right,
this
Bruce,
one.
Let's finish this up. You can find me on Twitter and on Twitch at Andy Weekend.
And you can find me on Twitter as @ManaBurn.
And we're the Temple of the False Pod, where our decks aren't optimized, but our plays sure as heck are fun. So get out there, get bluffing, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Hey everyone, Andy here. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Temple of the False Pod. Just a few housekeeping things here at the end of the show. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, pretty much wherever you can find podcasts. Subscribe and give us a review. It really helps out the show. And it'll show us what you like about our podcast. Also, we've got a Twitter and an Instagram. Our handle is FalsePodMTG, all one word. So be sure to follow us. Feel free to reach out to us there or drop us an email at falsepodmtg@gmail.com and tell us your favorite magic-related story. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you again to you and to Bruce. He's Mana Burned on Twitter, and I'm Andy Weekend on Twitter and Twitch. We're Temple of the False Pod, where our decks aren't optimized, but our plays sure as heck are fun. Have a great night, and may your fifth land be the temple.